Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Friday, November 10th, 2023. It's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Matthew Golombek. Matt, great to be with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Matt, to start, would you please tell me your title and institutional affiliation?
I'm a research scientist, senior research scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Tell me some of the things that you're working on right now. What's interesting to you?
Um, Lots of things are interesting, probably more than I can work on. My main, I'd say the biggest chunk of my career has been selecting landing sites on Mars. It's the kind of topic that really can only do at JPL. It's a place where you're needing to find a place where the spacecraft can land safely.
What's happening in Mars science right now? I know there's always a sequential narrative of one mission that's going on, one mission that's getting close to being launched, and something to be planned far out into the future. So what are you involved with in those three chronological aspects?
Okay, so I would say we've just gone through the past 20 years has been the renaissance of Mars science. There have been just about a mission every possible launch opportunity, which is once every 26 months when you can go to Mars. And we've probably had a dozen missions in that time frame. And it's been an incredibly interesting mix of both orbiters and landers. And the data has fed off each other, both an orbital view and a surface ground truth, if you will, view. And it started with Pathfinder in the late 90s. Went to Mars Global Surveyor, Mars Orbiter. There's been the Mars Express from the Europeans, Phoenix Lander, the Mars Exploration Rovers. So a whole series of rovers and orbiters that have really uncovered a huge suite of fascinating information about Mars. And right now we're in the first part of a very ambitious effort to try to return samples from Mars. And the first of that is the Perseverance rover, which is selecting cores that are placed into little test tubes, if you will, and sealed. And they'll be picked up by a subsequent lander and eventually brought back to Earth. And so most of the advanced mission planning right now is for what we call a Mars sample return, which is towards the a whole number of missions that would be required to get those samples back into laboratories here on Earth.
Matt, what is the state of play with Mars sample return? How advanced is it?
It's actually called a program, but it is a project that's in what we call phase A, which is the first step of actual project development. It is extremely ambitious, and the reason it's called a program is it takes two or three different missions, all of which are large, complex missions. So in addition to the rover that's there now that is picking up the samples, there needs to be a lander that goes and lands near that rover and accepts the samples from the rover. Those samples are put into a return, sort of a ball, if you will. That ball is put on top of a rocket and launched into orbit around Mars. Then you need a Neville spacecraft that goes and finds that ball and captures it and brings it back to Earth. And then you have to somehow land it on the Earth. And so that's two or three missions, as well as once the samples do get to Earth, they need to be in a containment facility that is like a Center for Disease Control facility that would keep those samples sequestered from any biota on Earth. And each chunk of those is a complex and difficult engineering task that is also quite expensive.
When you put it all together.
Yep. Probably the most expensive aggregate in terms of Mars mission that we've ever tried to do.
Matt, thinking about the expense, obviously this requires ongoing support in Congress from Washington, D.C., from NASA. What is the case to be made that this is such a compelling mission, that it's worth doing this?
I think that goes to why Mars is a compelling target. As far as we know, right now, the only planet that has life on it is Earth, and it's very clear that the sole requirement for life is liquid water. And of all the other solar system bodies, the only one that we have clear and unambiguous evidence that liquid water existed at the surface is Mars. And it occurred at a time when life first got started here on Earth. So the oldest microbial life on Earth is about 3.6 billion years old. And at that time, Mars was a very different environment than it is now. And there were clearly lakes. Perhaps there was an ocean. There was liquid water that drained across the surface and created gullies and channels. And there were even deltas where those channels entered into standing bodies of water and deposited the sediment. And those deltas are incredibly biogenically rich environments on Earth. There are lots of nutrients that are brought in, and there's a ton of biology that occurs in those water systems. And that's, in fact, where Perseverance is exploring a delta, an ancient one on Mars. And so the question is, what does it take to form life? Will it form anywhere that liquid water is stable? Or is there some other chance occurrence that went into this? And there's no place that you can study a question with, I would say, almost theological importance as that. It's right next door in the solar system. Okay, it's a little expensive to get to, but it's not impossible. And you can address a question of that importance in a scientific manner. And I think that's what is and has driven the Mars exploration program, and clearly is what's driving the intent to get samples back.
Now, the whole idea here is that there are facilities, laboratories on Earth that can make measurements and do studies that simply would not be possible in situ. In other words, any lab that we might send to Mars simply couldn't give us a richness of understanding and data that we can get back here. I wonder if you can explain just how much better it is to have these samples here to look at the questions that you've explained.
So, some of the instruments that we use to look at the detailed geochemistry and interiors of these rock samples are as big as your laboratory room. Some of these instruments, you build a laboratory to accept them. They're that large. Mm-hmm. Well, anything that you send to Mars is under intense scrutiny for mass and power, and everything has to be miniaturized. And you're going to spend a ton of money on these instruments to try to get them to do just a small portion of what you could do with the laboratories here on Earth. Plus, if you have those samples, maybe we design some instrument in 10 years that can do something that we don't even know about now. You have that sample, you can then begin that investigation. So having a sample here on Earth is always better than trying to miniaturize some instrument and stick it on top of a spacecraft, which is the most complex, probably expensive things that humanity builds. Everything is miniaturized and has to fit together onto this robot that is being sent into extremely difficult conditions and has to land on another planet before it can even start to do its work. No less rove across the surface and find the samples. So of course, if you have the samples in the laboratory, you can always investigate, far beyond anything you could even dream of doing on a spacecraft on another planet.
Matt, so I understand the sequencing and the decades-long planning that's going into this endeavor. Is that to say that Mars sample return was conceived within the boundaries of Perseverance? In other words, the capabilities of Perseverance and its capacity to drill and take core samples only make sense if there's a follow-on mission to go and get those samples.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a conscious decision by NASA to make collecting samples a part of Perseverance's science objectives. And for those of us that are sort of on the inside, that has dominated a lot of the operations of that spacecraft. It is hard work to find a diverse suite of samples that can be related to each other in a stratigraphic framework, older and younger. So you can see how this system evolved and changed over time. So yes, that was a first step. At the time that decision was made, there had been no decision about whether there would be a sample return, but it was believed that that was the first step you needed to do to begin to think about the next steps. And I would say that Perseverance has been so successful, and the rock samples that it's already obtained is a compelling suite of samples that you would love to return if you had the choice. And that's just not me saying it, but all the national academies and all of the large, august groups that weigh in on these things have all basically said that same thing.
Let's go into a little more detail about what Perseverance is getting and what its capabilities are. So Mars, it's a big planet. How far can it traverse across the surface? How do you know how to define a diversity of samples? And what is it actually capable of collecting in terms of depth, in terms of mass, in terms of density?
Sure. So some of that starts with the selection of the landing site, which I'll describe at some future time when we get back around to that. But what you want is a suite of samples that can address the major scientific questions that the mission is designed to do. And this mission is designed not only to take those samples, but to go beyond what the previous missions do, which was the previous mission showed that Mars was a habitable environment at 3.6 or so billion years ago. The Mars exploration rovers have shown that, as well as Curiosity rover have shown that there were liquid water systems at that time that were neutral pH and conducive to the formation of life. Not only that, the Curiosity rover, the previous one before Perseverance, showed that in that water system in Gale Crater, everything you need to support life existed. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, it was all there. And there were very interesting things happening within the lake that could have been an environment in which life could have gotten started. So the next question is, did life actually form there? And the best way to answer that is by returning the sample. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do in situ. Even the way we do it here on Earth is you culture the sample, or in the case of paleontology, you have the remains of that. And those are all very difficult tasks. So you want a water-rich system that existed at the time when liquid water was stable. If you had those rocks deposited in water and in a water-rich system like a delta, which, as I already said, are incredibly biota-rich environments, that's a wonderful place to go. And that is, in fact, the location where Perseverance went, to Jezero Crater, where there is a deposit that was clearly a delta when it formed. Jezero Lake was full of water, and there's a stream that is now dry, but that entered breached the wall of the canyon, of the crater, and brought sediment in and built out a series of very diagnostic rock facies, their top set, foreset, and bottom set beds, where on Earth, the size fraction of the material that's brought into the water is sorted by the distance from where the river enters the lake. So the finest grain material that's clay rich, micron in size, and very conducive to both any biological activity, but also to sequestering it. That is, if it existed, to capture it in the rock between these clay particles that are deposited in the bottom of this lake. So those are the kind of samples that Perseverance is getting. So they've gotten clay-rich sediments at a variety of locations. They have traversed up the entire delta, so they've gotten the top set, foreset, bottom set beds. So they've gotten the whole package of material that came into this crater. Not just that, but this crater is in a portion of Mars that has evidence for ancient carbonate-rich rocks. Carbonate-rich rocks on Earth are deposited by living organisms. And there's a feedback loop on the Earth between pulling carbon, in fact, out of the atmosphere. And the way we do that is by living fossils, calcium carbonate or shells or things like that. That's the way, in fact, this is going to go a little bit off topic, but the way the Earth has maintained its constant climate throughout geologic time is a geologic process that allows us to recycle those volatiles via plate tectonics and, in fact, living organisms. Okay, let's put that aside. That's too far to go for now. But so there are carbonate deposits on the rim of the Jezero crater, and immediately adjacent, there are phyllosilicate, that is, clay-bearing minerals that date back to the Noachian period as well. So there is a wide variety and diversity of rock types that are central to this location, to this main question of, was Mars a habitable environment in the Noachian? And what you want is a wide diversity of rock types. You want sedimentary rock types like the delta that I described, as well as some of these others. That's the kind of treasure trove that you want to bring back to Earth.
And the size of the samples, what are we talking about here? Like the size of one's pinky, a bottle of soda?
A little piece of pencil, if you will. It's sort of that thick, and it's placed inside a sleeve, and it has a top which seals it, so it seals it from any outside environment. So when it's brought back, everything that was in that tube is still in that tube. The desire is to keep it at moderate temperatures. You don't want to boil it or heat it or any of those things on its full round trip. And I think we have room for 10, 12, 20 samples, something like that, that fit into this thing that gets launched into orbit around Mars.
Now, because the samples are relatively small, a bit of a pencil, as you say, that must mean that that Perseverance is not drilling terribly deep to gain them.
Right. There was never an intent with Perseverance or any other spacecraft that, trying to think, we have dug into the ground at various locations with arms and things, but we've never tried to get dramatically below the near surface layer of the top 10 centimeters or so. So what Perseverance can do is it can clean off the outer rind of the rock, and then it can drill down into the rock to get a clean portion of that rock. It can also get, and has gotten, regolith samples or soil samples from a couple of locations, as well as atmospheric samples, and of course the omnipresent dust, which is everywhere on Mars, the red dust. So that's the assortment of the samples that we brought back. Total mass, half a kilogram. What's that, a pound or something like that. And there, I mean, the other question is, do we have um, instruments on Earth that can look at really small little pieces of rocks? And the answer to that is yes. And in fact, there's a tremendously interesting story about what happened to the laboratories after Apollo brought rocks back from the moon that spurred on development of instruments in a way that very few other things in geology have. So I don't think there's any question about the analyses can be done on very small samples. You obviously wouldn't want to use all of one sample in one analysis. You'd want to slice it and dice it, and you'd want to hand out the way they do with the Apollo samples is you write a proposal to get a sample to do some science with it, and only if that proposal is accepted do you then get a chance to do something with that sample.
Now, because the samples are coming from relatively shallow depths, right? What is the best response to the concern, between radiation and surface erosion? There may have been interesting things to look at billions of years ago, but they're now gone. What's the response to that?
Yeah, and that has been brought up for quite some time. And the concern is, in fact, that radiation would damage any organics that might have existed. But that question has pretty conclusively been answered by curiosity, which has clearly found organics in near surface rocks, organic molecules, not necessarily biogenic ones, but yeah, that clearly, and the reason that's the case is that there has been erosion of the surface that has taken off the surface layers at a high enough rate that the radiation has not killed all and disassembled all of the organics in it. So that same kind of environment is clearly occurring at Jezero. You can see that there's been quite a bit of erosion. What we see now of the delta is just a smaller piece of what it was. And those rocks are friable and easily eroded, and no question that's been occurring. So I don't think anybody's too concerned about that issue.
All right, so the samples get home. You mentioned there are some biosecurity measures that need to be taken. What's the idea there, and how far does that get us into science fiction scenarios about what might occur?
Well, it's the Andromeda strain, right? But you are bringing things from an entirely different planet with an entirely different, potentially different biosphere. Now, actually, it could be related to us. We know that rocks from Mars have come to Earth repeatedly through time. So it's even been suggested that we're all Martians, not just me, okay? that life started on Mars and came to Earth, in which case we're all related anyway. But okay, but still, it is a potential that there could be, I mean, the chance of actual living organism in these samples is really small, but simply to be safe and absolutely safe, these samples will be put into a containment facility that probably exceeds any containment facility that's yet been built on Earth. In fact, that containment facility will probably cost as much as one of the missions that we're going to send to bring these samples back. And those samples will be tested for quite some time before they are let out of that containment environment to be put into normal laboratories. If there's anything in them, those samples will never come out of that. You will bring the instruments to that facility. In that case, yeah. We don't really expect that to be the case, but
is there also a two-way street concern here that we could influence or damage any potential biological materials in the samples?
Yeah, so yes, which is why you want to keep them separate from, if you bring them back and they're exposed to biology, just like the Martian meteorites that land without our assistance, if you will, they're going to get changed by that. So yes, you want to keep them separate. So, you don't, So there's actually three parts to this, right? Whatever you send there better be clean because you don't want to bring biology with you, sample it, capsule it, and bring it home. And yeah, we found life. It was what we brought there in the first place. So that's not too bright. So that's all part of what we call planetary protection, where anything that goes to Mars is cleaned. And the level at which you clean it depends upon how likely that environment is to have actually have life now or at some time in the past and what you're going to do with it. So all the end effectors are extremely clean, and you try to keep all of that down to a minimum. And then of course when you bring it back, you don't want to be adding anything like that to it if before you actually do a lot of the analyses that you need to. Yeah.
Matt, do you have a sense of where this initial containment facility will be built? Will it be on JPL campus?
Oh, I don't think anybody has a clue yet. I don't think it's been decided. That's all, geez, probably of order 10 years away before the samples actually get back to Earth, at least 7 or something years. It's still,
And
so
once, assuming that these have been cleared to be safely researched, at that point, will they go to regular academic geology labs around the
yeah.
country, around the world? What will that look like?
Yeah, so I think it'd probably look a lot like the Apollo program. First of all, wherever this containment facility would probably have a lot of basic first order laboratory equipment that allows a first order assessment. So there'll be one that was just a geologist looking at the rock and saying what they see. Thin sections where you look at the petrology, what minerals are in the rock, and those are all kind of standard things. So that would probably be done right there and then. But what typically has happened with the Apollo samples is they're kept in that containment facility, assuming that they're clear, there's no biology or anything like that. That's then then professors or scientists would write proposals to gain access to specific samples with a proposal that says what kind of science that they're going to do with that sample, what kind of analyses, and what the results should be. And then those would be peer reviewed. And if they're accepted, then they would get a portion of that sample to do some science on. And that's still the way it goes on now with the Apollo samples that were brought back from the moon. So they're kept at Johnson Space Center in the containment facility. If someone wants to look at them, they're packaged up and brought to that laboratory. They do some work and then they're returned if it's a non-invasive procedure.
So because all of the emphasis here is on the search for extant or more likely past life, assuming all of this happens, the samples are studied, however long that it takes, there's some conclusive statement, goose egg. We haven't found any evidence of life. What is the counter media narrative that might say, oh, it was all for nothing, all of that cost, all of that effort? How do you counter that?
Well, I don't think it's ever. So whenever you do more science, you ask more questions, and usually those questions are more directed at the pieces that go into answering that broad piece. So it may be that you need multiple sample returns from a variety of different places on Mars to conclusively answer that big question. To think that you would find a particular single sample that would do that you might have to be pretty darn lucky. So I don't think it's this black and white. It's this yes or no. It's were all the building blocks there? Were there reactions? So a lot of single cell organisms, they don't live on photosynthesis. they're chemists. They live on reactions between rocks and water that occur underground. In fact, the biggest biota on Earth is hidden from the view. It's all buried in the pore space underneath the ground. And that's where, and most of that is not photosynthetic. It's these guys are chemists. They're living at the reaction space between water and weathering rocks that create microenvironments where they can use that reaction to fuel biological activity. So that's the kind of thing that we're probably looking at. It's not like you're going to land and find a dinosaur bone, right? A dinosaur is a incredibly evolved species that took 3 billion years of Earth evolution to create. And it may be that primitive life is common, but so-called advanced life, if we're advanced, is a much more unusual thing. So there's nuances here in terms of framing the question to that will further our analysis and our broad view of how to go about answering this.
Matt, in the way that planning for Mars sample return was baked into the capabilities of the Perseverance rover, will there be future missions that are baked into Mars sample return so that there is a mission after Mars sample return that Mars sample return itself makes possible?
Yeah, and don't know, because that's certainly beyond the planning horizon for anything. In fact, there's no other Mars missions after Perseverance that are even really in the planning stage besides sample return. And sample return is, as I already said, is a lot of these different pieces that's going to soak up an awful lot of money. So even if there is a Mars program beyond sample return, at this point it's totally unknown. But I would say in general that missions that come along are generally responsive to previous missions. So the Mars exploration rovers were responsive to both Pathfinder and Phoenix, or Pathfinder. Phoenix responded to observations made by orbiters. It showed there was frozen ground ice at high latitudes that it could go and study. And so missions always use science that's been done to ask the next question. So I think it's perfectly possible that some subsequent mission would build on and maybe try to answer a more specific question that came out of the work that was done for sample return or even some of the previous missions.
Now here I'll ask you to use your imagination because it's so far out into the future, but because there is some evidence, there is some suggestion of extant water below the surface on Mars, that there's water now, not just evidence of past water on the surface, but below the surface, current water. Could you see as the next mission, the follow-on mission to Mars sample return, something that could get down to those levels where the possibility of extant water leading to extant life is theoretically much higher?
So first of all, there's lots of reasons to think that a subsurface liquid water environment could exist on Mars. I do not believe there is any compelling data to show that such a groundwater table actually does exist on Mars. There is compelling evidence that frozen water is in the polar caps and it's in the high latitudes. There's ground ice clearly at the high latitudes. We've seen that. Whether that also means that at much deeper levels, and the current, if you look at the geothermal gradients for Mars, you would probably need to be going down a kilometer or more to get to that, a putative, if it exists, liquid water environment down there. So a kilometer deep is an extremely difficult place to get to, even on Earth, where we have thousands of people on hand watching the drilling process as it occurs. Doing that remotely, it's uh, it's it's hard to imagine. That is, yeah, that would be extraordinarily difficult. So until there is compelling evidence that liquid water exists down there, and it, it's also kind of the needle in the haystack, right? It's like looking for life now. You could look in that haystack 1,000 times with your drill and never find the needle. Doesn't mean the needle's not there, but it means that you're going to have a lot of missions with a sort of an ill-fated or no result. And that's really why we're looking at the Noachian, the most ancient rocks on Mars, where we know the environment was already conducive to the formation of life. And it happened at a time when life got started here on Earth. And so even if Perseverance does not find evidence for life, if it finds all the ingredients and it finds all of these rocks, we will make thousands of discoveries that will spur on Mars science, regardless of that other question. Whereas trying to go find that life now,
now, the capabilities of all of the Mars orbiters, all of the Mars landers, there isn't radar capabilities that give us some sense of where subsurface water might exist?
There is a report for subsurface water based on some of the orbital radar in one of the polar caps, maybe this that's beneath the ice of the South Polar Cap. But the interpretation of that data has been hotly argued as to how diagnostic and true it is. So that's why I started that conversation with there's no unambiguous evidence that liquid water exists down there now.
Another very future, I'll ask you to use your imagination again. Does Mars sample return get us closer to a manned mission to Mars?
I think so. If there have been, myriad studies by NASA and others to talk about what sort of things you would like to do before you send people. And it kind of, there's a little bit of a bifurcation. If your intent is to send people to Mars to plant the flag and say we were there and get back in their capsule and come home, then you could argue how much previous information you really have to have. Okay. If your intent, however, is to set up shop on Mars and have a habitat of some sort, then I think the answer to your question becomes much more like yes, because now you have to build habitats. You have to build places for the spacecraft to land. You need water. You need a place to go mine the ice to make water. You need things for the astronauts to study. God, I hope they send a geologist that can go do some geology. Okay. Yeah. I mean, now there's a much richer suite of questions and facilities that you might need on the surface. So the most recent NASA study has, they're setting up a habitat, and they have power sources, and they have roads, and they have a mining facility that makes ice and water for not only astronauts, but to send the astronauts back home. If you're thinking of a scale of that, then you not only need sample return, but I think you need rovers on the surface that scout out that landing site, or now it's this landing area, and make sure that you know that the environment is the way you want it. You on Earth, you would never set up a mining operation from pictures from orbit. You'd go down and you'd burrow in the ground and you'd make sure that the mineral or whatever it is you wanted was there, and you knew something about its concentration and so on. So if you're thinking of staying, even a habitat kind of staying, then yes, I think you need both sample return to know about the toxicity of the materials that are there. Are they building materials? Can you make habitat? Can you make structures out of that? Is the material you need that you want to harvest and do things with and so on? So then you need not only sample return, you need rovers with ground penetrating radar and probably some ability to look down beneath the surface to find, is the ice really there? How pure is it? How much dirt does it have in it? How are you going to get it into liquid state so you can do something with it? That sort of thing. So, yeah.
So in the first scenario, minimally, what Mars sample return will do is show that going to Mars need not be a one-way ticket. And that's obviously important as a moral component. We would never send someone to Mars without the capability of bringing them back to Earth.
And it's a long trip, so you can only go there and back every 26 months. So you're talking about a 3-year trip to get somebody of that order. It's 9 months to get there. You're going to land them. They're going to stay for a little while, right? And then it's 9 months to get back. You're talking about something of order years. This is not like going to the moon of a few days there and a day back or whatever, and you're done in a week. Nah, this is a major thing. You're off Earth for a really long time.
Matt, let's go to some Mars landing decision 101. So for you, what are the other experts in the room? And in your expertise in geology and geophysics, who else is in the room where you're collectively making these all-important decisions about where actually to land?
So there's two big halves to landing site selection. And the two big halves are science. What do you want to learn when you're there? And the other half is it's engineering, okay? If your spacecraft doesn't land successfully, it doesn't matter what wildlife things you might think you're going to get. If it doesn't land safely, you're not going to get them. And it doesn't matter what you say, every piece of hardware that we build, each landing system, has certain things that it's going to like and certain things it's not going to like. So there's engineering and there's science. So we call engineering landing site constraints, if you will. So most spacecraft don't like meter-sized boulders that they have to land on or deal with. That's not a good surface. They don't like really steep cliff edges that they're going to bounce off of and fall down. So rocks and slopes, material properties, you obviously want a surface that's hard and load-bearing. And there are places on Mars where you might sink into what I call foo-foo dust, dust from the atmosphere that's not load-bearing. You'd sink right through it. You might be deep enough you wouldn't see the spacecraft again. That's not a good place to land. So that's what you call engineering constraints, and it affects everything. Everything. The elevation that you can go to is how much atmosphere you have above you. The lower elevation, you're going to have an easier time to land on than higher elevations. The top of Olympus Mons on Mars, you're not even off the air shell You can't land up there. That's not possible. Okay. You don't want to land at high elevations. You need all of that atmosphere. It's thin, but you use it. So you want to be as low as you can. Latitude matters a lot. If you're solar powered, and even if you're not, it's a more moderate thermal environment if you're near the equator than if you're not. If you want to launch something from the surface, you're going to definitely want to be near the equator because you're going to get a boost from the rotation of the planet to get your thing into orbit. There's a reason we launch spacecraft from Cape Canaveral, Florida. It's pointing into the rotation of the Earth, and it's over water in case something goes wrong. You don't want, and you want to be as close to the equator as you can get to get the maximum push. Okay. Same thing for getting your samples and or anything back from wherever you are on Mars. So latitude, elevation, things you can't control are the atmospheric pressure changes by 25% seasonally on Mars. When you get there, and you don't have a choice in this matter, you can only go once every 26 months, you're going to get that atmosphere, and if it's a bad opportunity, it's going to be thin. If it's good opportunity, it's going to be thicker. You got nothing to say about that. And then, of course, there's rocks and slopes and so on. Okay, so that's engineering. But there's science too. Every mission has a suite of instruments. The mission has science objectives. The instruments have science objectives, things they want to study. And if you want to look for life, you probably don't want to be on top of a layer of igneous basalt. That's probably not the environment. So now you need particular kind of rock. So we talked about a delta for perseverance or water-related rocks, things like that. So now you have this whole suite of not just the rocks, but is there stratigraphy, rocks and layers that you can relate to one another and that you can relate to the overall geologic evolution of Mars. So you generally have these two chunks that kind of bounce together. So you want something that's safe and something that will enable you to do the studies you want. And every single site selection has been different because every single mission has been different in one. Even when the spacecraft is almost the same, like Phoenix and InSight, what they were doing were entirely different. So where you sent them was entirely different.
Matt, of course, it's not just Mars where JPL is playing a leading role in searching for life. There's the whole Icy Worlds program. Is this an asset for you, even if only you're an interested observer, to keep tabs on what those other missions are doing?
Yeah, there really hasn't been a mission to the surface of an icy body yet that would start to get that kind of information. But certainly it's tremendously interesting that there could be subsurface oceans on some of the Galilean or outer planet satellites and what they're talking about. And for those sorts of missions are interesting, but it's still pretty darn different from, we're talking about ice, not rocks. It's pretty different in that regard. I don't think the main tenets of any site selection that you were to do for any of those missions would be any different. It's going to be engineering. Can you land the things safely? And can you do the science you want to do at that location? Those two things are going to be phrased in the same way, and they're going to have to come together in a site selection activity. So let me just go a little bit more on that. So we have done site selections for 6, 7, 8 missions since Pathfinder. And with time, we've developed a process in which we have open science conferences that is for anyone in the world, anyone in the community to come to these conferences and give proposals about where to go with a mission and why you would go there, typically focused mostly on the science. And then we down select those missions to start gathering the information that we need to evaluate them in more detail. So for Perseverance, the most recent, there were 4 of these landing site workshops. I'm a co-chair of the committee, the NASA committee that puts these things on. And at the first one, we basically said, here's the latitude longitude constraints, here's the elevation constraints. Tell me where you want to go and why it's important. And then there's a steering committee that would basically try, and we order those from the best looking ones to the least good looking ones, and we'd start getting images with our satellites that are in orbit. So mostly Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, getting both mineralogical information as well as high resolution images. So the high resolution images allow you to see whether, okay, are there rocks there? Is it smooth? Is it just samples? And then you go through a process where you down select. So we went from 26, there were 30 sites that were proposed, and then we narrowed them down to like 10 or something. And then we narrowed them down to 4. And when you get down to 4, now you're making detailed maps of the surface. You're measuring the rocks and how tall they are. You're measuring the slopes to see whether this is an acceptable engineering location. You're also studying the area in much more detail scientifically, and you're even planning out potential traverses you might do with the rover. And then you get to a final workshop where you have 4, and it's just about those 4, and you hammer those 4 for 3 days until you get effectively, I think the last one we asked everyone in the room to vote and say not just which their favorite was, but very specific questions about what made that site. Is it good for this? Is it good? We had like 12 or 16 questions. And then the steering committee got together and made a recommendation, and ultimately the project makes the final call. They have to enable this. So there's this big process that takes as long as it takes to develop the spacecraft. And it has to be done at the same time that you're engineering the spacecraft, because when you start thinking about the spacecraft and when you've actually built it and designed it and tested it, those are not the same thing. And there are often changes in the spacecraft as it's being built that you have to react to from the landing site point of view. So it's uniquely a JPL kind of thing, okay? So JPL has 95% engineers. Every engineer known to man exists at JPL. I mean, there's not a kind of engineer that exists that is not. And then they have a handful of us scientists that know something about Mars. And you've got to fuse these two things together. It's the rubber meets the road. It's the airbags hit the surface. And you can only do it at a place that builds that spacecraft and has scientists that know something about what the surface of Mars looks like. So it's the singular activity, if you will. So I'm the only person that's done this for NASA, for Mars, since the modern era, since Pathfinder. There's only one of me.
Matt, because you'll know what to look for. If there's a certain level of apprehension that, the political winds in Washington can change, NASA might make different decisions with different leadership. What will you be looking for in terms of the budgetary environment and in terms of how far along Mars sample return really is before you feel truly confident it's a go, it's happening? Are we there now? Are we close, or is that some ways away?
No, I think there's still work to do. I don't want to get into the details of what's happening right now,
Sure.
but there has been a report that, and we know that NASA is looking at, so the program and the landers in a phase A, and it's been studied for a while, and they're moving along, but there is a re-architecture study that's going on now because it looks still more expensive than it originally looked to be. And so I don't think we're quite at the position where it's all going to happen, and we know that for sure. I think we're closer than we've ever been. There have been at least two or three previous sample return studies that got kind of far within NASA and JPL, but never got to this level. So there's an agreement with the European Space Agency. They're doing part of it. There's, multi-international things. So I'd say we're closer than we've ever been before. Whether we're actually sure that it's all going to happen at this point, I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but we're, as I said, closer than we've ever been.
So you're feeling pretty good about it, all things being equal.
Yeah, we're studying places to land the sample return. That's what I'm doing now, is trying to find the location to land the lander such that the Perseverance rover can meet it and deposit the samples. And so there's a site selection. We know it's going to be somewhere around Jezero Crater or nearby, but you still have to pick the site and you have to certify that it meets the objectives that you have in mind. So that's already going on.
Well, Matt, let's go back. Let's establish some personal history. As an undergraduate, you were already interested in geology. Were you interested in non-terrestrial geology, even at Rutgers, or that came later on?
So it was, I think when I was an undergraduate, there probably wasn't, maybe there was I don't know if there was even a career called planetary geology.
I mean, you graduated before the launch of Voyager.
Yeah. So I didn't know that there was a career there. I was interested in it. It seemed interesting. I certainly was very interested in geology. My undergraduate major was in geology. I think I took one class that was available at my undergraduate institution, which was mostly about meteorites and not much about, it was pretty basic. I said I was interested as I was graduating and went to grad school in structural geology and planetary geology. And I went to a location where I did both of those for my graduate career. By that time, the Viking data was back, and there was a career there. I didn't know if I was going to be for sure into it. It wasn't a very robust environment yet. It's pretty much the doldrums from Viking onward. I mean, the Voyagers, but if you weren't on that mission, there wasn't a lot of support. There wasn't a very big field. And I didn't know where I was going to end up after that. I did after my PhD, I got a postdoc at the Lunar Planetary Institute in Houston, which is right next to Johnson Space Center. I did that for 2 years. That's pretty standard for PhDs that are interested in academic, and that's what I am, an academic. So, and then JPL offered me a job, and I accepted it, and I've been there ever since.
Tell me about the geology geophysics program at the University of Massachusetts.
So I worked with, I was very fortunate to work with two structural geologists at UMass that were also in the space program. And they worked on both the moon and Mars, and I had the ability to work with them. There was also a geophysicist there that did paleomagnetism, and I did some of that as well. So I really got a pretty broad exposure to a bunch of different topics and things that were interesting back then. Um, so yeah, it was a good starting place.
What did you focus on for your dissertation?
So it was very interesting. So this is a little bit of history here.
Please.
Uh, my master's degree was on lunar grabens, which are fault-bounded valleys on the moon. And when I finished that and I was deciding about a PhD topic, both of my advisors said, well, planetary is not a whole lot happening in planetary. You might want to make sure that you're doing something in terrestrial science so that if you needed to, you could get a job. And the dominant jobs, of course, is the oil business. And at that time, at the University of Massachusetts, just about every major oil company came at about graduation time and hired just about anybody who was interested in working in the oil patch. They got jobs. And it was, I mean, this was almost like a feeder program. If you were interested in going into oil and gas geology, you could get a job by having a master's or a PhD. So they said, okay, this is, if the planetary program, nothing else happens, you at least will be employed when you get done with your PhD. So I did a terrestrial PhD. It was a mapping thesis. Had nothing to do with any planet whatsoever. But I was still interested, and I did some stuff on the side that was planetary. And and when I finished, it was the year before the what was it? The gasoline, there was not enough gas and people were in lines, and the oil business stopped hiring geologists the year before I finished. And there were no geology jobs. And in fact, there haven't been any geology jobs since, really, because it's all chemists and engineers, and that they already know where the oil is, it's just getting it out. So there's not so much in the way of geology that's going on at the oil business. So there was no jobs available. That was so I was all ready that if I needed to, I could get a job. And though I don't think my heart would have been in. So I took a postdoc that was more towards planetary.
Matt, the
And it was
road
also,
not traveled. Had you gone on, if you could extrapolate your dissertation research, and that would have become an academic career, what
it
would
would have
that
been
research have looked like?
I would have been a structural geologist in both earth and planetary science, and would have been just like any academician at some university writing proposals and doing research on that. But
Have you followed the research at all? Have you followed what you worked on, where that's gone?
so I'm not a structural geologist anymore, and I haven't been for a really long time. I'm a Martian now. I am. I only work on Mars, and I don't do things that are structurally or geology related. I don't do anything that was related to my dissertation. I've reinvented myself several times since then.
Is there any such thing as structural geology on Mars?
Oh, yes. And when I first started, I did do that. In fact, I wrote a whole slew of papers about the structural geology of Mars, Mars tectonics. I wrote the last review paper on that topic. It's in a book somewhere that you could fall asleep reading. So I'm still quite knowledgeable about it, but I don't actively do research on it anymore. My research focus has changed with with a lot having to do with what I spend most of my time, which is looking for landing sites. And that's looking at remote sensing data and relating it to ground truth. That's what you're doing when you're looking for a landing site. You're predicting, if you will, what the surface is going to look like before you get there. And if you think about it, there's not a lot of fields in planetary geology where you get to see if you were right in your lifetime, maybe ever. You might write a paper about something that will never be tested. But I write a paper before we land that says, here's how we found this site, and here's what it's going to look like. And after we land, I say, okay, did I get it right or did I not? How did I screw up? So that's kind of cool, right? You get, and now I've done this 7 or 8 times. I lost track.
Now, Matt, in choosing your postdoc, were you self-consciously pivoting toward planetary science at that point? Did you recognize this is where you were headed?
No, I did. I went to all of the postdocs that I considered seriously. I was going to do both planetary geology and Earth geology. That's the way and the one I picked had that capability as well. So, in fact, when I was at LPI, Lunar Planetary Institute, it was what they were calling a rift. They had this initiative to study continental rifts. That was a big topic of study back then, and I was participating in that with a whole bunch of geochemists and geophysicists, and it was a wonderful environment to be part of. And I wrote all sorts of papers about the Rio Grande Rift. That's where I did my dissertation, and I was following that trajectory as an academic, geologist would. So it wasn't until I got to JPL and really started working on missions that I sort of changed and stopped doing that research and started doing things that were more related to this relation of orbital data to surface data. And that's really what my expertise is now, yeah.
Matt, do you have a sense of the origin story of the Lunar and Planetary Institute, how it got started and why Houston?
Yeah, it was started. In fact, it was originally called the Apollo. It was the first workshop after the first Apollo, and they brought back the rocks. They had a workshop to sort of talk about scientifically what were those rocks and what were them. So they wanted an independent from Johnson Space Center, which was the doing organization, that would be more like a think tank. And it originally is called the Lunar Science Institute, and then they broadened things out to Lunar Planetary Science Institute. So it's basically supported by NASA. And what it does now mostly is support conferences and workshops and things. They do have a small science staff as well to help with that activity. It's not a very big place. Maybe 30, 40 people kind of thing, maybe 50 people. But when I was there, it was a rich environment to sort of develop, yeah.
Is there an advocacy component to LPI like there is with the Planetary Society?
No, because if you're NASA, you don't do that, right?
Right.
You're the doing organization. You don't. Yeah, right.
You're not advocating the mothership.
Just like JPL doesn't, or any of the other NASA centers. NASA itself can, but it typically does that through National Academy of Sciences, that sort of thing. But yeah.
Now, what was your original connecting point to JPL?
So when I was at LPI, I was on a committee called the Cartography and Mapping Committee, which was a committee that NASA did to make sure that the maps that were being made for the planets were helping the scientific community. So I'm guessing that still exists somewhere, but they basically look at the cartography program, which is done dominantly at the U.S. Geological Survey in Flagstaff. They were the ones that made these quadrangle maps for Mars, and they made sort of the base maps for the Mars and the Moon. And there was this science group that would look at what they were doing and offer opinions and ideas about how to improve things. And one of the other members was a scientist at JPL, and I interacted with him for probably a year or so. And as my postdoc was ending, he said, you really ought to think about JPL. You would do well at JPL. And so they invited me out for an interview, and I interviewed, and I eventually came.
What were your early impressions when you arrived at JPL? Was it exciting? Did it immediately strike you as the place to be?
Well, so I'd actually been at JPL prior. So I was a guest investigator on the Viking extended mission. A professor was, and they sent me out to JPL to get some maps and get some of the data that we needed to do the kind of science we wanted to do while I was a grad student. So I had actually already been at JPL. And I was in the Viking operations area while it was occurring. It was pretty sleepy by the time I got there because it was just the orbiters by then there. But you could talk directly to the engineers, and then the images would come down as they would take them. I'm really interested in this area, and then you start getting pictures. That was pretty cool. So yeah, it's always neat to be at the place where, that's where it's really happening, right?
What year did you arrive at JPL? Was it 83, 84?
83, yes. So I'm just my 40th year here.
Wow.
And I keep saying it's only because I probably had 4 or 5 different careers within that where I did different things, that
keeps it fresh.
Yeah, well, and it allowed that flexibility, if you will, that I could change from being a project scientist. I was the project scientist on Pathfinder. That's dominantly a management job, right? You're generally not doing a lot of science. You're making sure all the pieces are working in the right order. And when I got done with that, I decided I didn't really want to do that I really want to go back to doing research. And so I had to change my trajectory, and I've had to do that a bunch of times. But JPL's always had enough opportunity to, and at least for me, I've been able to find niches that I've been happy with. So
just looking at the chronology, you start in 83, Mars Pathfinder lands in 97.
Yeah.
Is it all Mars for you right from the beginning? Is there a viable Mars rover program?
There was no Mars. Viking was dead. There were 20 years between Viking and the next mission.
Yeah.
In fact, it was the doldrums of the planetary program. There was nothing happening whatsoever.
So in your first decade, what did you do? What did you work on?
So I did science. I just worked on a whole variety of science topics. I was involved in some of the early measurement of plate motions, VLBI and GPS measurements, where we actually were measuring. Got a bunch of papers that I did about that. I worked with a whole bunch of different planetary people. Eventually, I started working on advanced studies for Mars that were ideas about what you could do, but none of them ever happened. They were all just kind of view graphs, and then Pathfinder came along, and it was like, oh my God, this is a real mission. We could actually do something with it. We actually go to Mars and get some fresh new data, and that was tremendously interesting.
Matt,
I call myself the oldest Martian. Okay. So since 1993, I have worked on nothing but Mars.
Yeah.
If it's not Mars, I don't do it. And you can only do that if there's enough work to support you.
Right.
And I don't know if there's another scientist that started doing that continuously for longer than me.
So for your first decade, just doing, planetary science, was Caltech an asset to you? Did you work with Caltech faculty at all?
No, not back then.
Was that not in JPL's culture?
It wasn't in Caltech's culture.
Interesting.
And I don't want to say anything more about that.
Well, perhaps I can, and you could just nod your head. Is the idea that there is a perceived hierarchy where Caltech faculty wouldn't work with JPL scientists? Okay. Was this
Yeah,
irksome to you? Were there opportunities to sort of change the equation?
they tried. Um, so there was one time, there were a couple of years where all of the incoming grad students would come and talk to some of the JPLers but none of them could actually work with you because they weren't a Caltech prof, and uh, there it has changed, and it's changed for the
Well,
better.
that's good
There
to hear.
are I'm a visiting associate at the Geology and Planetary Division now, and have been for probably 10 or, and I've worked with, geez, a handful of the faculty on written papers with them, and it's been nothing but good. No, nothing bad to say, but I think there was a real cultural change in the view and the interaction. And there's a lot more going on now than there had been then. I taught a class at Caltech, so they were changing faculty. They wanted the surfaces graduate course taught, and they asked me to teach it, and I was thrilled to teach it. And I had an office down there, and I interacted with a lot of faculty, and I have nothing but good things to say. They have great people and really good, and they're pretty open to, but it takes, how do I put this? You need a reason to be. It's an organic thing. You're working
Sure.
on something, and they know something about it, and you start working together, and that's what drives it, really.
Given
Yeah.
that this has shifted and it's for the better to the mutual benefit of Caltech and JPL, are there any heroes in this story that you can point to that fostered this, relationship?
I
Is it a division chair, JPL director, Caltech president that sticks out in your
I
memory?
think a lot of it has to do with the attitude of the division. That's my personal view. And I think a lot more of the faculty are involved in more of the missions as actual, like, co-investigators on the missions. And I think they're much more aware of the kind of work that happens at JPL and how honestly special it is. And I think they've looked at the talent that we have at JPL, and they recognize that there's nothing bad about having that involvement.
Sure, sure.
So I think, I think the involvement's been much better, and I've been pleased as punch to be able to work with the faculty at Caltech in the last probably 10, even 12 years. Yeah.
Now, did you wake up one day and learn about the Pathfinder mission? Were you involved in
No.
sort of the early iterations of the program?
Well, so as I said, there were these studies that were happening, and they were on all sorts of things, and I was like the study scientist that was helping the engineers, and at some point there was a study called a network mission to Mars, which was called Measure Network. And the idea was to put down 12 surface landers that did seismology and atmospheric science and a little bit of geology. And the idea is that you could use the seismic waves to understand about the interior, and these atmospheric stations would allow you to understand about the atmosphere and so on. And it was studied for a series of years. And when the price tag came out, it came out to the 1B number, which was B being billion, and that was far too much for, and so the thing kind of got semi-canceled. But then there was this idea that there was this Pathfinder, which would be the single first demonstration that you could put a small, inexpensive lander on the surface of Mars and do something useful. And it was designed as a tech demo, a technology demonstration. So not really a science mission. And the idea was to demonstrate a low-cost landing system. At the time, all of JPL missions were these, Galileos and these big, expensive, multi-billion-dollar with 20 instruments on them, and they're complex and they're expensive and they take forever. And the idea was back then, the NASA administrator was Dan Golden, and he wanted something faster, better, and cheaper. Faster, better, and cheaper. And so I was the study scientist on Measure. And when the 1 billion number came out, that seemed kind of too much. At the same time, JPL was working on initial mobility concepts. And they had a thing called, I forgot what the rover was, but it was this giant rover. It was bigger than your car. And it had, maybe it had pods or something, but it had like this big giant computer on it, right? Like a full mainframe. Back then, that's the only, this is before laptops, right? There were no personal computers, right? It's hard to believe, right? So they were just these mainframes. So I had a mainframe on the thing. Well, that's this big giant computer, right? Now you need an air conditioning system or a heating system to keep, because computers like constant temperature, right? So now you have this big thing around the computer to keep it happy, right? And now you've got this big spacecraft, so it needs big wheels, and the thing was this giant. And it, of course, when you got around to thinking about sending it anywhere, you needed this big launch vehicle, and that means you needed a lot of money, and it was drowning in the weight and the mass and it was just at the start of the computers. There were chips, and there was a fantastic JPL engineer that figured out that you could do things that were more like reactionary. So like a fly has built into its brain that it cannot flap its wings until it jumps off the surface, because its wings are long enough it would break against the surface if it flapped. So this is a and/or switch. Do not flap wings until you've jumped off the surface. Okay, and they figured out that you could string a bunch of these and/ors together, and you could actually have a rover that would kind of move itself around. And Charles Alachi, who was then an assistant lab director, not the director, he was decided that we should do a demonstration of this micro rover. I was the study scientist to help that. And the idea of getting this little, so we built this little micro rover. It was as big as it was like your printer or something, a microwave. It was less than a microwave oven. And it drove around, did a few little things, and everybody was like, wow, this is pretty cool. So Pathfinder was the tech demo with a little micro rover. So that was the key. The micro rover is going to prove that mobility was useful on Mars. At the time, a lot of the geochemists were just saying, we don't care what kind of rocks we get from Mars, just land, get me a scoop of dirt, and I'll tell you more about the solar system than some of those were at Caltech, by the way. We don't care where, and just bring it back. And most of us geologists thought that, gee, this makes a little more sense if you can rove around and pick up the right rocks, and not just any old rock, and not just the dirt, and so on. So that was the beginning of Pathfinder. And because I'd worked on all the things that had come before it, I was sort of the natural to become the project scientist.
How did you shift to all of those administrative, managerial responsibilities?
Well, so first of all, so let me tell you a little bit more interesting. So when I accepted the job, most of my academic colleagues, actually not most of them, but some of them said, what are you doing? You're throwing away your science career. You're working on a tech demo that has no science. That's not what NASA should be doing. You're wasting resources and you're wasting your time, and this is going to kill your career. And my thought was, here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity to get some new Mars science. Even if it's a small first step, it's something that you can do to show that there's a utility of this sort of exploration. And I don't think I have to argue for you now that if there hadn't been a Pathfinder, there would not be a MER, a Mars Exploration Rover. There hadn't been a MER, there wouldn't be a Curiosity or a Perseverance. So it all started with Pathfinder, and you got to take that first step. So it's not like this instant. It's like you're still working on some science, but it's just that being a project scientist is a full-time job, and it's all immediate, and there's fire drills every single day, and you have to be involved in them, and you just don't have time to write papers or even to sit down and think critically about what you would do over writing a science paper. And it's just not something. So 5, 6 years, I was pretty much doing that. At the end of it, I made a conscious decision that I wanted to be a scientist, a research scientist, and not, I just didn't really want to go into management. And that was among the hardest transitions, because all your grants had lapsed. So all of my grants that I had that were supporting me, JPL is a soft money environment. If I don't bring in money, I'm not employed. All of a sudden I had to transition. I had to rewrite those proposals. I had this transition period where I had to sort of redo all of that. And that was one of those career changes. If I was 2 or 3, that was my third change, if you will. But it was a good one.
Tell me about the launch. Tell me about the launch.
Now I'm a researcher. So since then, I've actually been a research scientist. I publish papers. I write.
You did it.
And I love doing that.
Now tell me about the launch of Pathfinder. What was that like for you?
There's 2 points for a space mission that are pretty definitive, right? The first one is the launch, and the second one's the landing, right? So the launch is a Delta II rocket with solid rocket boosters. 6 of them are ground lit and 3 are air lit. And of course, all this in detail because you're having the thing built. I remember it was at 2 a.m. So it had a 1-second window on Earth. It did not have a variable assist upper stage. So you can only launch at 1 second per 24 hours on Earth. So the first night, I think we rained out or something. And maybe even the second, but the second or third, it was clear. We got up at 2 a.m. and you're there. It's the middle of the night. You're groggy and you're watching the thing go up. And the whole time you're going, let it go safely. And I actually remember counting the solid rocket boosters, the 6 that fell off, and then counting the 3 airlit ones, just like, okay, did that go right? It launched fine. It actually had a bit of trouble in cruise. Let's see if I can remember the story. We almost lost the spacecraft. The third stage, when it fired, put soot on the star tracker or the sun finder. One of the two, can't remember. I have to go back and look at it. And the spacecraft couldn't figure out where it was. It couldn't get attitude control. And so they turned it on, and the thing can't lock on to anything. They eventually troubleshooted and figured it out, and it turned out that several of the sensors on the Starfinder were not occluded, and they figured out how to just train the algorithm to use those in order to get attitude control. And if you don't have attitude control, you can't do the trajectory correction maneuvers you want, and you bias. When you launch to Mars, you don't launch at Mars, you're biased in case you lose the spacecraft because you don't want it hitting Mars with all the dirty stuff around it, right? So you're biased off. And then, of course, landing is the 6 or 10 minutes of terror. And this hadn't happened. Of course, we'd never landed with airbags before, and we'd never done anything this crazy before. And I mean, the whole project cost, the lander was 150 million, the rover was 12, the launch vehicle was 40 or 50. I mean, the whole thing cost less than the movie Waterworld that you never saw. And we were going to Mars, and we were going to do some science. I mean, that was a tremendous opportunity. And of course, the public reaction was no one was prepared for what that. I'm trying to think of a mission that the public got as involved in. I mean, so back then, before the internet, right, we were on the front page of every national paper for a week. A week. At the time, it was the beginning of the internet, it was the largest internet event in history. People were enthralled that this little rover could go out and they could see it move from one place to the other. They were completely involved in it, and it was amazing. It was amazing. We were NASA heroes.
And you were planning. You knew you wanted to go back to science, even amid this success.
Well, so that was the public success. So, yeah, I mean, I could have gone into something totally outside of science as well. But no, I didn't really want to do that. But, I mean, that all kind of died down after a while, right? You know, usually that kind of thing does. I mean, I got a book out. I got to write a book from it, but no, I consciously made the decision I wanted to be a research scientist.
Tell me about the book.
It's a National Geographic book, so it came out the year later. I was also I was the science advisory for a couple of movies with Hollywood. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Invited to, speak all over. I mean, I remember one of them, they'd come in, they'd offer a project. They come into the project and, some of them, they were specific to someone, anybody. So I remember it was the Iowa Pig Convention wanted somebody from Pathfinder to come and talk to them. I don't think I did that one.
Matt, after all this success, tell me, either in your direct participation or just being around the failures of Mars Climate Orbiter, Mars Polar Lander. What did that mean for you? What did it mean for Mars Science? What did it mean for JPL?
So that was, if Faster, Better, Cheaper was the crowning success, if Pathfinder was the crowning success of Faster, Better, Cheaper, Polar Lander and Climate Orbiter were the depths of despair. All it takes is one thing to go wrong on a spacecraft, and we both know what happened. There was at least one thing that went wrong on both of those, and in both cases, a more robust engineering team probably would have caught it, or could have caught it, or might have caught it. And they were just stretched so thin that I don't think they they could find it. And they didn't find it. Me personally, I didn't work on either of those, so I didn't didn't really affect me too much. It was certainly a blow to JPL, but JPL had lost Mars Observer before Pathfinder. Remember that was an orbiter. I was a participating scientist on that mission, and that was a loss for sure. Um, I think that was more towards the idea of smaller, more focused spacecraft. Instead of having these big giant things with a lot of instruments, make them smaller and focused. So what came out of Mars Observer was Mars Global Surveyor, which was a slimmed down payload from what was on Mars Observer. And that was fantastically successful, but it was fewer instruments and again, more specific. And that's sort of the way the missions then went. They were not these big giant things. They were much more cost constrained, which was kind of in the fiscal environment at that time. So
Now,
um,
between 98 and 2002, when you join MER, are you doing science that's not attached to a mission?
yeah, so that was me getting back to being a research scientist. So actually, I was still doing some structural geology on Mars then. But I was involved in MER from the very beginning. So as soon as it got the start, I became the landing site scientist on it. At that time, I was not part of the science team because that was that was a science team that was selected from a proposal that was written that was smaller. But I worked for 3 years prior to the mission launching during development on the landing sites and the landing site selection. So I worked on that, and then I became a participating scientist on MER, and then in fact became the project scientist. I was the last project scientist who, lasted. In fact, I was the longest. I think it was 7 years, but that opportunity lasted 15 years. That was a big chunk of my career, was working on those two rovers. I published scores of papers, and I had so much fun.
But
I
did you
had
go
so much
back on your
fun.
vow never to do that level of administrative work
No,
again?
it wasn't administration. See, I was not. So first of all, I was originally a participating scientist. I was a co-investigator. My job was to do science. I did things as well. I planned the pathways between Victoria, well, from the original landing site to Victoria Crater, and from Victoria Crater to Endeavour Crater. I did that as part, but that was science. That wasn't, and by the time I became project scientist, it was a quarter-time job and not a full-time job. And so it was a little bit of baby bit of administration, but I could still do a lot of science. So it wasn't, yeah. And of course, I obviously knew how to do the job.
Matt, to go back to the friends who were concerned that you were throwing your career away, doing a technology demonstration with Pathfinder, at what point in your involvement with MER did you feel great that, no, Pathfinder was the first step to doing science? What did that look like for you?
um, I guess I guess when I would be, I had to write a proposal to be a participating scientist. I was a member of the science team, and I just threw myself into them. They were tremendous missions, and it was so easy to carve out and do science and to affect where the rover went. So you get it's so much fun. It's like being on Mars. So you get the data in the morning, or the data comes down at night. You look at it in the morning. You have 2 hours to decide what to do next with the rover, and then you have the whole day to put the plan together. So not only was I was this SOWG Science Operations Working Group chair, so I was in the ops room with them as we were developing the plan, and I did that for 10 years or so. So the data comes in, and you're like among the first people to ever see this place on Mars. And then you have to decide what to do next. Okay, so what do I see here that tells me? Is there a rock that we ought to go look at? You had to do all of that, and then you had to meet with the science team or some subset, and you had to come to consensus about what to do, and then you had to put the plan together to do it. And yeah, it's just like being on Mars. I was on Mars. I mean, I was on Mars. I was on Mars. Okay. This idea that you have to have a human being on the surface of Mars to experience it, that there's dozens, maybe hundreds of people at JPL that are on Mars. They live on Mars. They operate a spacecraft on Mars. Your consciousness is on Mars. You're on Mars. It's now it's still a baby step. You know, I'm sure it's different if you were actually there. but you're there. You're on Mars. And that's the closest thing is you can get to being on Mars until we are on Mars.
Matt, how did you become the landing site guy? How did that happen?
Well, so I was the project scientist for Pathfinder, and that became something we had to do. The project had to figure out where we were going to land. And that was a tremendously interesting science thing you had to do, because it wasn't just the spacecraft and is it going to do all the things it's supposed to do, but where are you going to send it and why are you going to send it there? And what are you going to do that's going to make it interesting? And that was fun because you got the whole planet. Where are you going to go? Why? Where are you going to send this? What can you do with the micro rover with the APXS on the back that would enable you to find the most out about Mars? Well, remember at that time, only Viking had been there. And yeah, we had these Martian meteorites, so we figured there were these big basalt volcanoes, so we thought there was some basalt, but we didn't know if there were any other kind of rock types. We didn't know anything. So that was this tremendously interesting kind of science activity that was part of it. So I took that on. I said, this is fun. So I ran the site selection. So I was inside the project and outside. We even had outside. I went to LPI and I said, we ought to really do a workshop on this. And so we did 2 LPI workshops, that was just me saying we ought to involve the science community in this. And so it was really fun. So when we got around, the next mission was MER. It became very clear that what I had learned from doing Pathfinder was a recipe, and that there weren't a lot of other people that knew about this recipe. In fact, there was just me or a couple of us, right? So I said, well, gee, what if I help the project? I'm at JPL. They know me. This is a good thing. JPL needs somebody to do this, right? If you have spacecraft going to Mars, it'd be good to have somebody that knew where to send them, right? This is a growth field. So I figured out a way to become the landing site scientist for MER. And then MER was, Pathfinder was what I said it was, and both MERs were what I said they were. And then it was like all the engineers, every time the mission came along, they said, got to get Golombek. That's the guy. He knows how to. So I just became a success. By success bred more success.
Do you have insight as to why there were 2 rovers, why Spirit and Opportunity?
Oh, yeah. It was headquarters that actually suggested. First of all, the opportunity that MER was going was incredibly advantageous. In other words, when you got to Mars was near the peak in the atmospheric density. So you could land more mass at the same elevation than you could if you got there when the atmosphere was thinner. So it was a prime opportunity to send a spacecraft. And everybody knew, even from the beginning, that taking a Pathfinder rover and sticking it inside this tetrahedron was going to be intensive and difficult to do. And mass is always a problem. And these spacecraft, both of them had to go on the same Delta II that Pathfinder went on, which had a fixed size of the shroud, so you can't make it any bigger, and it only has a certain amount of mass that you can throw to Mars. So you were constrained from the beginning. And I think there was concern that if one failed, that it would be a pretty negative look on the Mars program overall. So the suggestion, I think it was at headquarters, it probably was Ed Weiler at that point. He would have been the head of Code S, saying maybe you should send two. So if one of them fails, you can still claim success. Interestingly enough, when you build two, there's actually advantages to just building one, because you can test different things on different spacecraft, and you can optimize that testing for where they are in the clean room and the assembly rooms at JPL. So the engineers loved it. They thought it was great, but it was a crunch. It was 3 years to build both of those. Pathfinder was 3 years, which was the fastest anybody had ever done something to Mars. And I think MER was even a few months less than that. So, and of course, the launch date is an absolute, right? The dog ate my homework is not going to do it. It's either ready to go on that spacecraft and you have full confidence that it's ready to go, or you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
How much science were Spirit and Opportunity designed to do?
A ton. So they were designed to be geological explorers. And it's interesting. I didn't recognize it at the time. For me, they were the best because they did things that were almost like field geology. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have super sophisticated in situ instruments, but they were sophisticated enough to get at rock chemistry and rock mineralogy, and you could see high resolution images, but you didn't need to spend weeks coring and breaking it up and sticking it into this laboratory and sitting around and waiting like Curiosity did. Curiosity in many ways is driven by those laboratory instruments, just in the same way that Perseverance is driven by getting those cores. It can't do geology, nor could Curiosity. Not that they didn't, but because so much of the spacecraft was built towards those other things, it had to spend a lot of time and energy on that. But the MERS, it was like discovery. You'd go and you'd see things and you decide what to do, and then you did them in a fairly short period of time, and then you went on to the next thing. So the ability to cover what we do, 20 kilometers, more than that, right, with Opportunity over 10 years and discover that suite of things, I don't know if that'll ever happen again. And for me, it was the surface geology and how did those landforms get to be that way? How did they relate to the orbital imaging? I learned so much about what helped me do the next landing site selection for Mars Science Laboratory for Curiosity from that experience of relating where we went with the rover to what we saw from orbit. It was like each time we drove to a new place, and I say, okay, did I recognize that in the orbital images? Did I get it right? Did I see that connection? what's dangerous, what's not.
So at a certain point, were you dual-hatted with MSL, or that was just sort of adjacent to
Yeah.
what you were doing?
So actually, it's kind of a funny story. Um, yes, I was dual hatted. So I was doing site selection for MSL while we were still operating the rovers, but I wasn't full time on it. I was just part time. And so I was probably, I don't know, quarter, half time on MSL and quarter time on MER. And so I had something else that was going on. But that's the way scientists are at JPL. You mix. I mean, right now I'm part time on sample return. I'm on the helicopter finding airfields for it to land again, landing sites. Okay. And I'm still doing InSight science. I was the landing site lead for InSight and the geology lead for that mission. And that just ended, but I'm still doing some of the science for that. So you always have these different things you're doing at the sort of same time. Yeah.
Was there ever discussion about a helicopter for Curiosity?
Not that I remember.
Because that was just too crazy? It was too far out?
I don't think. And so the technology and the idea to do a helicopter in Mars's atmosphere didn't come along until, I can tell you when it came along exactly, because I was the PI of the proposal that proposed the helicopter. It was just before the proposals were due for the instruments to make up the instruments on Perseverance. So the mission had been phased 8 and it was going forward, but it hadn't done the instrument selection yet. And so what NASA does is they put out an announcement of opportunity, says we're going to fund these kind of instruments that do these sorts of science. You propose an instrument, and if you're accepted, you're put on the team and you're put on the project. And so we, JPL, I was the PI, proposed the helicopter to assist, to be a scout for the rover, to map out areas it would go before it actually, being a rover without a roadmap is not particularly efficient. And although we have high resolution images, they're not quite at the resolution that you can see individual outcrops and or places that you might want to go and study with the rover. So the proposal was to use the images from this aerial platform and fly out and get a more regional view of the geologic units and help decide where to send the rover, and even to help drive it there more quickly. And proposal was not selected, but it was interesting enough to both JPL and NASA that it became this little add-on, again, technology demonstration that actually got on the space. Now, in this case, I went from PI to nothing, right? Because it became just a tech demo and there's no science. So what's a scientist doing on it? And I had no role. So there's a case where helping in the beginning didn't help me much at the end.
Did you see Curiosity as an evolution in capabilities and in science from Spirit and Opportunity, or was it something different?
No, it was definitely, it was an evolution, and the idea was to get at more definitive mineralogy. So geologists study rocks. Rocks are made of minerals, and that's our currency. If you can identify the minerals, you can identify the rock. If you can identify the rock, you know how it formed, and you know the environment it formed in. Was it liquid magma that froze? Was it laid down in water? That's what geologists do. Show me a rock and I can tell you how it got there. But we only got iron mineralogy from MER, and we got geochemistry. Now, chemistry is nice, but it doesn't tell you how those elements are arranged into minerals. And what we really want is the minerals. And we like the chemistry too. That's also interesting. So what Curiosity was designed to do was to get definitive mineralogy, where you're actually measuring the minerals directly. And they had two instruments that enabled it to do that, but it required them to actually get samples and core the rock and get comminuted samples that they put in those instruments. And they did a lot of chemistry too and other things. So that was the evolution from kind of like a field geologist looking at the rock. So yeah, it's kind of a basalt, right? And I can maybe see some crystals and pieces, and I get the chemistry, and yeah, it looks like a basalt. And to, oh, I know this is a basalt. It's got calcium pyroxene and yada, 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 everything, all the details in it. That was the change. And then the success of that really led to perseverance, which is, can we find, we know there's habitable environments. Can we get those samples that we immediately might bring back to Earth that would enable us to start answering the questions that we started this conversation with about by whether there actually was life that got started there. So
now, where does InSight fit into all of this?
Well, it was not in the Mars program. InSight was a discovery mission, and actually kind of a funny story. So at the end of Curiosity, I can tell you this because you're interviewing me. So the end of Curiosity, we had done the landing site selection. I was not in the science team for Curiosity. So I was kind of done, and I'm looking around, I'm going, I got no more landing sites I'm out of business, right? I've got nothing to do here. I'm trained to be this expert site selector, and I got no sites to select. So I needed a mission to select the site. Well, I had been a co-investigator on a number of previous discovery missions that had proposed a single lander on Mars, which was dominated by a seismometer with Bruce Bannert, who's the PI of the mission. And I knew he was studying and thinking about sending it in again for the next discovery call.
Matt, was there reason to believe that Mars was seismically active? What was the reasoning behind the seismometer?
Yeah, I wrote a paper about that as a structural geologist. In 1990, I think it's 1990, maybe even before, I wrote a paper that predicted the seismicity of Mars. And it was based on the structures you could see at the surface and the slip that had occurred and the time in which the slip had occurred. And we did a whole bunch of stuff to show that it was likely. But the most cogent argument for why Mars would be seismically active, and this, by the way, your question was not unusual. All sorts of people said this. Why are you going to send a seismometer to Mars if you don't even know that there's Mars quakes? You're not going to measure it. It's a silly thing. Well, we had two places where we had measured earthquakes, the Earth and the Moon. On the Earth, superactive tectonics, quakes happening all the time. I mean, all the time. The Moon was actually reasonably active, and there were tectonic quakes that occurred, even though not much geology has happened in the last 3 billion years. And basically what we said is Mars is going to be in between. It's not as geologically active as the Earth, so it won't be that active. But it's had geologic activity throughout time. From basically the oldest rocks on the surface you can see are probably 4 billion years. We have lava flows on the surface that are 2 million years old. So Mars has been active throughout solar system history. There has to be tectonic activity. This planet has to be having both tectonic activity and quakes commensurate with its geologic activity that's somewhere between the Earth and Moon. And we actually estimated the total number. And by the way, That estimate is pretty damn close to what InSight has found. So, of course, there's going to be Mars quakes. There's no question. So that was actually used as part of the proposal. So anyway, I talked to Bruce and I said, "Are you going to submit this proposal again?" He goes, "Yes." I said, "Well, do you think you have a role for me?" He goes, "I don't think you're going to be interested in this mission. It's just a seismometer." And I said, "Well, you still need a landing site, don't you?" And he goes, "Yes." I said, "I'm your guy. I can get you you make me a co-I, I'll run the landing site program for you." And this was just me to get some more work, right? I was interested in the mission as well. So I did that, and the mission was successful. It won the competition, and it's incredible competition to win a discovery mission, because you go from the proposal to a thing called where you actually have a NASA visit with this review panel of 50 people that ask you questions before they do the down selection. So we won this. So we're on it, and now I had some work, right? I had a site to go find. At the same time, they decided that they were going to do Perseverance. Now I had two landing sites to find. So those site selections went on at the same time. I was actually doing two of them at the same time.
Were they mutually reinforcing? Was involvement in one beneficial to the other?
No, none whatsoever. So because the science that they were doing was so different. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the tools that we used on the characterization side, that was beneficial. So it's a little more involved, but the way we learned to map the rock distributions on Mars, measuring the shadows from the rocks in high-rise images, we made some advancements that helped us for both of the subsequent selections. So there were things that peripherally helped, but the science was so different. So InSight didn't care where it landed as long as it was safe and flat, and it was safe to put the instruments down. It didn't matter what kind of rocks were there. It was looking for Mars quakes. The surface geology had nothing to do with it. Perseverance is all about surface geology. That's the most important thing. They couldn't give a shit about a Mars quake. So no, they were pretty disparate and different, but that's fine.
What were some of the key discoveries, the contributions of the InSight program?
Oh, so I mean, I would say we don't fully know. There is so much more that will be learned from the InSight data that hasn't been ferreted out yet. Mm-hmm. It's a data set that's amazing. Mm-hmm. So the proposal said, we're going to tell you how big the core is. We're going to tell you whether it's solid or liquid. We're going to tell you the mantle and the density distribution through it, which will help you determine the mineralogy. Okay, certain kinds of olivine polymorphs or minerals are going to be stable at different pressures and temperatures as you go down. Whether the so-called perovskite line is going to be there or not. We're going to tell you the thickness of the crust. It's a 1D, right, from the lander down. And of course, it not only answered all those questions, but because we got large quakes, we've actually determined the crustal thickness from surface waves elsewhere that have come across this way from one part of the planet to the other. So we know a dozen places where now we know the thickness of the crust. We know the density of the core and that there's a light element in it. And there's substantial evidence to suggest a molten layer at the bottom of the mantle. So not iron rich, but now olivine rich. That's so hot, it's molten. And so exactly what the light element contributor to the core is is still being debated. So it's going to be another 10 years before all of this plays out. And that goes directly to how a terrestrial planet coagulates from the planetesimals that exist at the beginning, and whether it starts out molten, when the free fall occurs, that it gets dense enough that the iron goes into it's going to tell you how you build the terrestrial planet. And that's even beyond what we proposed. So, InSight is a huge success, a huge success. I had nothing to do with the seismometer, but I, of course, picked the landing site and I was the geology lead. And what was so fun about it was that the waves not only go through all this other stuff, it has to go through the surface materials. So those geophysicists were super interested in what we could tell about the top kilometer from the geology and what we could see from the craters and the impacts. And it was just so much fun and a great group of people to interact with. And yeah, just been a great mission.
Matt, the planning for Perseverance, to go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, if not the name itself, when did the idea of a sample return mission really start to take hold in the design phase of what Perseverance's capabilities would be?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. So I was not the study scientist for that. I wasn't involved in the early planning and what went on. So I don't know. I know that there was, so in the previous decadal surveys, they talked about sample return and how important that was. And there was this recognition, and there had been a number of, as I said, steps earlier to try to get sample return going. But the idea of making a first step using the rover and using that as kind of a benchmark. So think about it. If all you get there and you get dull, boring rocks, not that geologists would never think a rock was dull and boring, but if you couldn't get the rocks that we have gotten, that suggests that this was a completely habitable environment, one that you'd want to bring those samples back to do the next level of looking at. That having those sitting and ready to go, that would be part of the impetus to get a sample return to happen. So I think there was probably some thought process like that this is the first step. If they just sit there for a while, okay, they sit there for a while. I mean, eventually we're going to figure out how to go and get those samples and bring them back. So why not collect them at least for the start?
So the idea is that there wouldn't be the next rover to do this. It would be Perseverance.
Would be Perseverance. Yeah, would be Perseverance.
Matt, how did you operate?
And that, of course, had a pretty major impact in the instruments. So the idea was, just in a general term, is you trade out the sample laboratory on Curiosity. So it's the same rover, basically. Same rover. But instead of a sample laboratory that's in front that you feed samples into, you now design a system that allows you to collect and seal samples instead. And now your instruments don't have laboratory. There's no laboratory instruments on Perseverance. They're all in situ instruments that are sort of remote sensing, but you can grind down and look at the rocks, but you're not taking a sample and sticking it into an instrument. That's the difference. And so it had a major impact in terms of the instrument selection and even what the mission would do.
How did you operationalize all of your experience in landing site decisions when it came time to think about Perseverance?
I mean, the job was pretty similar but different. So we haven't had a conversation yet about how site selection has changed and how dramatically it's changed. And probably the best way to answer your question is just to take a minute and
Please.
give you a little snapshot.
Yeah.
So for Pathfinder, the landing ellipse was 300 kilometers by 100 kilometer. That's as accurately as you could target a position on Mars. We didn't know the ephemerides. We hadn't been to Mars, and we didn't know where Mars was, okay? We had no tracking of the spacecraft. So its position was uncertain. Where you hit the atmosphere to begin your trajectory for EDL that would take you to the landing site was uncertain. We had no new data from Viking 20 years earlier, and the highest resolution data, you might see something the size of a football stadium, and what the engineers were most worried about were rocks the size of your chair. How do you do that, right? How do you go from remote sensing, crude remote sensing data to what does this surface look like down on the ground, okay? To MER, we had Mars Global Surveyor, and we had the Mach camera, which took images at 3 meters per pixel. Well, that was a huge advance. Now you could see things that were the size of a car, right? Put 4 of those pixels together and, a pickup truck, you could see things that big. And at least you could get some idea of kind of what was down on the ground, right? But in addition, there were thermal instruments that were giving you thermal inertia and thermal physical information that was more. So that was a huge thing. And then we go to Phoenix, and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter got there. And this is a true story. Prior to Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter getting into orbit around Mars, we had picked 4 zones on Mars where we were going to use the cameras on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter to pick this site. And that ellipse was 100 kilometers by 30 or 20. It's much smaller than what we had had before. And the first things that the camera did when it got into orbit, I remember this so distinctly, it took pictures of the previous landers. And it took a picture of Viking 2, which was a 20% rock abundance, a very rocky site, which they were pretty fortunate they landed safely at in retrospect. And you could see the shadows of all of the rocks that you could see from the lander. So for the first time, we had a high enough resolution instrument from orbit that we could see rocks that could damage a spacecraft. That had never been the case before. Now we get to Mars Science Laboratory, or Curiosity, and we're landing in a 6-kilometer radius. Maybe it was 10 or 20, something like that. And we got complete coverage in stereo of the entire ellipse, where we made digital terrain models with 1 meter postings. We could see slopes on the scale of the lander and the rover. Unbelievable information that you could get. All of those previous cases, you determined the probability of success by taking the landing point distribution file of how many times you land close in versus out on this ellipse to what the hazardousness of the ellipse is, right? There's always some place in the ellipse that's not as good. And I mean, with an ellipse that's 60 kilometers, there's craters, there's bad things in that ellipse that are going to kill your spacecraft. You can't avoid it. You can't find a place that won't have any hazards. All you can do is make the number of times you would land at those places small enough that you still had a 99% chance of success. Okay? That is what ruled from Pathfinder all the way through Mars Science Laboratory of Curiosity. We started out with 2020, as it was called, before it was called Perseverance, and they weren't quite sure exactly whether they needed some new landing. And as we were doing this landing site selection, all of the sites that were the most highly ranked by the science community were not safe. They got crater rims and deltas with slopes that would kill your spacecraft, and they rocks all over the place. And they were not going to be safe if you simply landed there and you calculated a 99% chance without knowing. So what they did is they used something called TRN, which is terrain relative navigation, and they enabled you to divert from where you're going to come down by 60 or maybe 100 meters on either side perpendicular to the landing azimuth. So you're coming in this way, and you could go north or south perpendicular to that up to, I think it was 100 meters, maybe a little more. And you could control coming down to any spot along that line. And the only way that works is if you use TRN, which is terrain relative navigation. So as you're coming in, you're taking images of the surface and you're matching them to a map that we made using the high-rise data from the orbiters. We made the best map humanly possible of the landing site, and we stuck it in the brain of the rover, and it compared it. Now, when it found a match, it knew exactly where it was. That's important because this could get more. I will skip the next part. Okay, it's very important to know where you are, because now you'll know now if you map the safe places in the ellipse. You don't need all of the ellipse to be safe. You just need enough places that are bigger than, I forgot, 10, 20 meters, that have no rocks and are flat and are safe. And you mark those as safe places. And so what you do is you create a hazard map that tells you numerically how likely you are to be safe if you land at that point. And as it comes in, it knows where it can divert to, and it goes to the safest spot it can in that line. So you say, wow, that's pretty cool, right? So now we have an ellipse that's 6 kilometers, way smaller than anything. It's got hazards all over the damn place. It has rock hazards. It has slope hazards. It has inescapable hazards, places where you could land, but you couldn't drive out of because of the sand. There's so much sand that you'd get bogged down and you would never get out of it. Inescapable hazards. We now had to map the entire ellipse, and we had to find all of the safe places. And we had to be right from orbit so that when the spacecraft makes its decision and it comes down there, it's just as safe as you said it was going to be. And the spacecraft's $2.5 billion. So now my job is way harder than it had been. Now I got to know where every rock is. I got to know where every slope is. I got to know where all the sand is. I got to know all this shit I didn't need to know before. Okay, so why did we get on this whole thing? So this had to do with, remind me where we started on this, that I needed to tell you all this. Sorry.
The question was if you were able to operationalize all of your previous experience in site landing decisions for Perseverance.
So now every site selection, you wound up learning some technique or some capability using the remote sensing data to get more information about the surface that you didn't do before. And that, so even every single one, you had an evolution of the techniques. And in fact, we had science teams that worked. We put out AOs for help. We needed digital elevation maps, detailed digital. We needed mosaics where those were merged together to make this map. We needed the ability to count rocks. We needed detailed high resolution thermal inertia. We needed atmospheric characterization so that as the spacecraft knows the atmospheric conditions that it's going to go through, to be prepared for that as you come in. If you're coming in with a dust storm, it's a different atmosphere than if you're coming in as clear conditions. So we had all this information, and we had all these orbiters and landers in our previous experience with driving, for example, MER, all these places that we'd been, to use as proxies to help us with this next level of characterization on the surface. So yeah, I would say all of those were probably necessary and needed to enable you to get to that level of detail in terms of characterization of the surface to be able to do this whole TRN thing in this landing that Perseverance did in this place that you couldn't even consider in the previous site selections. They were, far too hazardous and not able. And you needed all of those orbital and surface missions in the past to enable you to better predict what was down on the surface from what you had seen in orbit. Because when you've driven all these distances with MER and Curiosity, and you'd seen what it looked like on the ground compared to what it looked like in orbit, that took you so much further than you would otherwise. So that's the part of being part of a program, right? It's just not a one-off and then you forget it. It's you build on what you learned previously. Yeah.
Has machine learning or autonomy become a factor in site selection for Mars science?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the way we count rocks is machine learning. That it would be, you don't have enough grad students or even undergrads to count rocks by hand. So think of this giant ellipse, and you identify them by the shadows. So if they're this thing that sticks up and they cast a shadow, the shadow is in fact bigger than the rock and easier to identify because it's super low in albedo. And JPL was the perfect place because there had been work on actual hazard avoidance on landing that used a variety of these techniques that they were testing. And using machine learning, basically what we did is we take an image, a high-rise image at 25 centimeters per pixel. We would segment the shadows from the everything else. Now you have the shadow defined. We'd fit an ellipse to the shadow. From that, we could calculate the diameter, which is the small axis of the ellipse. And the long axis and the angle of the sun tells you the rock height. So now we can measure all the rocks, but not all of them. They have to be big enough that the pixels will pick them up. So we actually could measure all the rocks that were bigger than about 1.5 meters. But because we had done this at places on the ground where we also measured the rock distributions, we came up with a model. It's actually called the Golombek rock model. And we developed it during Pathfinder in 1998. And it's worked since then. 35 years. No, it's not that long. 25 years. The Golombek rock model. And it tells you what the size frequency distribution, if you can estimate what the total population of rocks is. And we fit that to this measurements, gotten incredibly sophisticated with it. So that's all machine learning. Could not have done that any other way. And you probably couldn't have done that any other place where you had that mix of talent all together thinking about landing spacecraft. Could not have happened at a university because universities tend to segment by departments, right? It's harder to get anyway.
Matt, the landing of Perseverance right in the middle of COVID. What was that like? What were the challenges on top of all of the challenges you were expecting?
Um, so I don't know. I was not really involved in the mission by then. So did the site selection and we followed it up to landing. I was not on the science team. I'm not in the science team. I think I'm a collaborator, so I am aware of the data and I know some of the stuff, but I'm not actively doing science on it or anything. Um, but so I didn't, I was not at JPL during the landing. I was not part of the active team that's been operating the spacecraft. So yeah, no, I
For
don't
you,
know.
was working at home an easy enough transition?
Yeah, I still work at home. I've never gone back. So we all went remote. Um, just I guess it was March of what was it now, 2.5, 3 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And it I didn't find any difference whatsoever. All of our meetings are done on WebEx or Zoom or um, all the interact. We have weekly, I mean, thousands of meetings. You dial into them just like this. You have the meeting. You know what you're doing. Eh, 90% of everything I do comes across the internet. It's either email or you're on some website. I'm looking at you. You're looking at me. What's so when they started asking people to come back, they had an option if you wanted to be just totally remote, and I applied for that, and everybody said, "Yeah, we don't need him around. We know what he does. He knows what to do." So yeah, so I never went back. Yeah.
Matt, we'll bring the
In
story.
fact, in fact, they made me give up my office.
Oh, so you can't go back.
JPL, the space is incredibly tight.
Yeah.
It's not palatial like at Caltech. I mean, you get these little cubby holes, and I've been in that office 30 years. And the day they granted me the off site, they said, "Okay, when are you out?" It took me a week to pack up that. I mean, I just threw everything out. Didn't matter.
Matt, we'll bring the story right up to the present. So nowadays, how much is Mars sample return occupying your time?
So I'm about a quarter time sample return, and that's almost entirely finding airfields that are safe. So I'll give you a little backstory here.
Sure.
When we started out, what's different about ingenuity and about sample return is they're both susceptible to hazards that you can't see in a high rise. So things that are 10 centimeters and several more than 4 or 5 centimeters high are hazards for the helicopter. I mean, the helicopter is this teeny little thing, right? It's not bigger than your laptop with little spindly feet. It can't land on a meter-sized rock. It has to, and in fact, the constraints are the rock has to be, no more than 2 inches, 5 centimeters high. Well, you can't see that in a 25 centimeter orbital image. So we started out, we said, well, okay, to figure out the place that we're going to deploy, we need images from the rover. So Perseverance would take some images and we'd scout it out that way. And then we say, okay, this is okay, safe to go. And the first 5 flights, which were the demo part of the flight, they all landed kind of at the same place. So then we said, well, okay, the spacecraft landing, we might as well use it for something. So let's go fly somewhere. So the first place we said, well, we'll fly off. We'll take an image with the helicopter of the surface, and then we'll fly back to the place we were and we'll land back there because we know that's safe. Okay. So think about that. It's pretty inefficient for trying to go someplace, right? You would always have to go there and come back the first time and then go there the third time. So that's not efficient. So we had to figure out a way to figure out a safe place in the high rise images that was safe enough for the helicopter when you're looking below the pixel range. So that was a bit of a challenge, if you can imagine. But the advantage we had was that we had the rover on the ground and we had some experience of what it saw. So again, we're relating orbital to surface. It saw lots of things and we could characterize that. And then we knew what it looked like from high rise. And as it went, we built up this, okay, this is bad, this is good kind of thing, right? And there are a bunch of other things that are beyond that, but that's sort of what you use. So you're using that inference and the experience base of what you did on the surface to now predict. So it's not just what 8 or 9 landings, those were the lander spacecraft from outer space, but we've picked, what are we up to, 40 something sites for the helicopter based on high rise, using similar kinds of things. So, and the lander, the sample return lander, is susceptible to things that are 30 to 40 centimeters. Well, that's only bigger than 1 pixel. You're not going to see that with a high rise image either. So we're trying to infer even smaller things from the high rise to what's acceptable for it. And that's the challenge, yeah.
Are you satisfied at this point in your career that you've achieved the right level of balance between science and administrative responsibilities?
Yeah, so I don't do much admin. So I run science. I mean, running a landing site selection, there's some admin, but it's the science of what it's doing that's most important. So I don't follow the contracts. I get other folks to do that. But what is that contributing to what we're learning about the landing site? That's the part that's like doing science. That's not. And then I do a whole bunch of it myself as well, just because I'm curious and interested. And
so the right balance for you is very little administrative responsibilities.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, Matt, now that we've worked up to the present day, for the last part of our talk, if I may, a few retrospective questions about your career, then we'll end looking to the future. So having spent so much time on Mars, being a full-time Martian, what does that tell us about this period in JPL's history? Would that have been possible in an earlier generation? Do you think it's possible in a future generation? Or is there something really idiosyncratic about the timing of your career?
So I think I've lived through different chunks. So I call the doldrums early on, where you didn't have a lot of new data and everybody was trying to wring out whatever they could from the old data. And sometimes it would get, I don't want to say fantastical, but sometimes the interpretations were maybe not all that well supported by the data that was there. And that's kind of sorrowful, right? Because there's no information. But the last 20 years have been the renaissance of Mars science and of Mars exploration. There's been no other time where we have gone from this tech demo with this little baby rover to a thing that's as big as your car, and look at what it's doing. And the number of missions and the level and different kinds of information that they brought together and the synergy between those informations, both orbit and surface, has been just spectacular. So I have no complaints whatsoever of, Now, the difficulty in the future is that most of the money is going to sample return, and sample return is an engineering job. It's already been said by NASA, there won't be any science. It's just go get those samples and bring them back. And the science is after you bring the samples back. So I think there's a concern, not just mine, but among the science community that the Mars science community is going to have less support. There's going to be less missions. There's going to be less opportunities to work on it, and it's probably going to shrink somewhat until we get the samples back, and then it's kind of a different. It's not planetary geologists. It's petrologists and geochemists that work on samples, and that's very different from most of the people working on this now. So I hate to, say it's going to get worse, but it's kind of, yeah.
If you'll permit yourself, or if you ever permit yourself to detach from being a hard-nosed, evidence-based scientist, have you gone through periods where you're more or less optimistic about the likelihood of life on Mars?
I guess I never. It's the journey. So either way, we're going to learn amazing things, and amazing things about our neighboring planet. And either answer is just as profound if you ever get to it. So I don't want to say I don't care, but it doesn't matter which answer. The journey and how you get to that location, and what's the evidence, and what else you learn in that while you're doing it, that's the truly interesting aspect to me.
So you've set yourself up for a win-win perspective. There's no losing equation here.
No losing. No losing here.
Matt, in the grand sweep of history, whatever that answer ultimately may be, what do you see as your contributions to answering it?
It takes a lot of people to make a successful Mars mission, and it takes. I'll give a little pump to JPL. There's no place else in the world where at one location you have everyone you need to conceive of, design, build, launch, operate, get the data back, and write papers about it, all in one place. There's nowhere else that matches. There are places that do parts of all of that, but nowhere else in the world where all of that happens in one place. And what that, and I hate to talk about economics, but everyone's on soft money. You need a charge number to charge for your salary. So you have interest and impetus to work with varieties of people on a variety of different things. And that synergy of, you cannot land a spacecraft without scientists and engineers working hand in hand. and if there's a hallmark of my personal career, it's I'm right at the middle of that. Okay. Landing a spacecraft is, it's the rubber on the road. It's the airbags hit the surface. If you want to land that spacecraft, you have to work half time with the engineers, and you better be a good scientist, because it's not a hypothesis whether there's a rock there or not that's going to wreck your spacecraft. You better be pretty damn sure, to the tune of billions of dollars. Okay, I don't gamble. I don't go to Las Vegas. I don't gamble on landing sites. It's show me the data. Okay, you better know to the best of your ability. You better do everything humanly possible to make sure that that spacecraft will land safely. And that's probably my contribution right there.
Finally, Matt, looking to the future, What's your timeline, and are you attaching that to however Mars sample return might play out? Do you want to the best of your ability, do you want to be around to see what happens?
I don't want to tell you how old I am, but I'm almost certainly not going to be around. Well, I certainly won't be a full-time employee. I don't think they have them that old. No, I'm probably towards the end of my career here, so I don't need anything else. I've done it all.
You're good.
I'm happy.
Matt, this has been a wonderful, wide-ranging, really fun conversation. I'm so glad we were able to do this. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.